Nicholas Mulder is an assistant professor of modern European history at Cornell University. His previous book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, was published in 2022, and he is currently close to completion on a book entitled The Age of Confiscation, Making and Taking Property in the Creation of the Modern World. He also started a Substack last year, which contains some of the best commentary on the geoeconomic conflicts unfolding before our eyes, often with very useful historical analogies for thinking about sanctions, embargoes, and tariffs. It's called WeltinnenPolitik. It's hard to imagine a book being published at a more perfect time than Mulder's 2022, The Economic Weapon. After the start of the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and subsequent announcements of massive US-NATO sanctions against Russia, many of us turn to Mulder's book to try to make sense of our period of great power tensions, economic and technological competition, and major war in Europe. The Economic Weapon brought readers a fresh and technical analysis for interpreting the breakdown of peace in the interwar period and the dashing of liberal visions of international cooperation. Most importantly, Mulder's book did not just reaffirm the well-known cliches of liberal orthodoxy about free societies versus totalitarianism, but situated economic sanctions as a paradoxical tool of coercion and warfare, sometimes conceived as preventing war, while other times as precipitating it. His story began with the efforts of British naval officials and financial authorities during World War I to leverage British naval power to enforce a blockade against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The central paradox of his narrative is how a tool originally designed to escalate a total war strategy and coerce civilian populations could come to be thought of as a tool in preventing aggression in the League of Nations. While sometimes effective, Mulder also shows how diplomatic wrangling, ideological competition, and the Great Depression often blunted multilateral commitment to the use of the economic weapon. And fear of sanctions by the late 1930s itself became a driver of strategic visions that saw territorial expansion as the only way to secure the energy, food, and extractive resources that could maintain the viability of revisionist states. While far from any kind of apologia for the actions taken by the Axis powers, there is something in Mulder's account of the spirit of A.J.P. Taylor's Origins of the Second World War, in which the Allied powers are not absolved of some blame. First of all, do you think that's a fair summary of the economic weapon?
Well, yeah, I think that you picked up on most of the important points, and it's very much a book that tries to do a few things at the same time, recover the original intention behind sanctions, but also try and really place it in its context as a instrument that had quite different uses and associations with the kind of things that we associate it with today. And finally, and I'm glad that you picked up on that particularly, besides just talking about sanctions, I also wanted to put forward a slightly different account of the interwar crisis and of internally destabilizing processes within globalization, the way that they interacted with those processes. Um, and yeah, of course, I mean, I could easily write an entire other book about it that would have probably become a lot longer. So I had to be a little concise when it came to those bits. But part 3, Sanctions and the Interwar Crisis of the book, is very much trying to develop that. And I'm also going to be developing some of that a bit more in future work.
What would you want contemporary intellectuals and policymakers to take as lessons from that period regarding sanctions? And also maybe what's also different about this period than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first and the most important one is that showing the historical difficulties of using these instruments effectively should inspire some humility, I think, in everyone, and a bit of a humble attitude about what's possible and about the unintended consequences, the risks involved. Increasingly, I think there is more of a sense of that in public debate. Agathe de Marais wrote also an important book, Backfire, about how the sanctions shaped the world against U.S. interests. And I think that it's important really to have a much deeper reservoir of cases that shows not just how difficult it is to achieve the outcomes that you want, but how you can get a bunch of outcomes that actually maybe make you on the whole worse off, even as a sending country. And that's not always something that really percolates, because I think the unipolar moment really accustomed a lot of policymakers in the West and in the US in particular to think about sanctions as this instrument that you can use. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, then there's no problem for you. Increasingly, I think we are in a world where there are serious costs to usage, even if the effect is not achieved. And the critique of sanctions has for a very long time been a humanitarian one, an essentially moral one. And that certainly has its place. It's very important. But what I tried to put forward in the book is, besides recovering some of the moral debates about sanctions, also putting forward a critique that is based on actual considerations of power and interest, more in the canon of realism, if you will, that even if you do not think that those things are as salient in international affairs, there are still plenty of reasons to be skeptical, or at least very cautious about the use of sanctions, that they might backfire dramatically, and in fact harm one's interests when you use them, particularly against very large targets that have the ability to retaliate.
One of the things you do really well in the book is explain how, within the context of the League of Nations, the sanction tool is, primarily conceived as a way to stop aggression, right, or to limit the power or durability of an aggressor. But in our period, sanctions are not often. I'm trying to think. Is it half the time, a quarter of the time? But it seems under the last few American presidencies, sanctions have been used to limit the capabilities of a state rather than always stopping an aggressive act or a takeover or invasion of another country. And the United States was able to do this in the unipolar moment, more freely. But it's also been implicated in all these regime change and kind of oftentimes very grandiose foreign policy objectives. Do you think that the U.S. has in this for these reasons has kind of lost the thread or misrecognized the real strategic purpose of them?
I think so. And maybe what's particularly underestimated is the fact that sanctions continue a certain policy of engagement or even confrontation, right? They're oftentimes seen as substitutes and alternatives, but they, on the receiving end, are not always a way of making relations turn any better. And I think Iraq is a very important case here, where there was a war, of course, fought by the United Nations to stop and roll back the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which is very important. But after that, there was a great uncertainty over what the continuation of sanctions against Saddam were really meant to do. Was it to make sure that he would disarm his entire army and give up weapons of mass destruction? Was it to make sure that he would never again have the military power to invade? Or was it actually to make him step down from power? So there was big disagreement among the P5 and the Security Council about that. So as a result, there was no clear yardstick. And then the result was sanctions that were grievously harmful to the Iraqi population, right? Like hundreds of thousands of people who died in the 90s because of disease, bad sanitation, really dire circumstances, lack of food.
The infamous Madeleine Albright interview, yeah.
Exactly. That on its own was a big failure of policy. But more to the point, it did not solve the question of Iraq in the Middle East from the point of view of from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy. And in 2003, this still was ultimately something that was only, in a sense, resolved, right, or finally ended by another military intervention. Then it went all the way to Baghdad. That then, of course, led to a long and very costly, and I would say extremely harmful occupation that did a lot of damage also to the American social fabric and America's respect and role in the Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of a piece you wrote about Russian sanctions and some of the deadlocks and how Europe is thinking about it. I want to get to that in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But what you were just saying reminded me of some of the mid-30s international wrangling about sanctions on Italy before its invasion of Ethiopia. And one of the things you describe is how U.S. cooperation in them was predicated upon a consensus within, the American Senate, I guess, right, to agree on neutrality and therefore not helping either side versus sanctions just on Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wanting to ask you, are there any general lessons one can take about different countries' processes of policy formation? Do some lock in sanctions more and then are unable to sort of diplomatically adjust given, say, cessation of a conflict, or one side being willing to come to the negotiating table?
Yeah, you mean in the 30s also in the context of the Neutrality Acts?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those were a really interesting set of laws that are a very important part of the rise of US hegemony, paradoxically. So, in retrospect, we can see that the Neutrality Acts really paved the way for American involvement in a lot of conflicts. But their aim was a congressional desire to rein in the presidency's ability to do just that. And since then, sanctions have definitely been one of the powers of the president that is relatively unrestrained. It goes through an executive bureaucracy and is enforced, of course, by the Treasury and other um, arms of government with relatively little by way of meaningful, recurring, and frequent controls. And the law that allows for a great amount of leeway is also the one that Trump has used actually in the last year to impose these huge tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. So you can see in the US that initially the ability to participate in conflicts, to send money, to provide weaponry, and to take sides and to supply both economic goods um, and money to different sides in conflicts was very heavily constrained. That's what the Neutrality Acts were about. But even there, what's interesting is that you had three different ones, and over time the Neutrality Acts began to be adjusted kind of under the radar and surreptitiously in order to privilege one side or the other. So officially, for example, the president was required to list certain items that would be barred from exports to those countries. But if he picked the right ones, he could pick ones that one country needed much more than the other. So officially, there was a blanket ban on supplying any of these things. In practice, however, it would benefit one side more than the other. And then finally, the big run up to World War II and to Lend-Lease, which was really kind of a big positive supply program that decisively broke, right, with the Neutrality Acts. There was a restriction that any country that wanted to buy from the United States had to pay in foreign currency reserves, in cash, basically, the cash and carry policy. And that effectively privileged France and Britain, which had big reserves. Germany had almost nothing. So it was still a way of formally keeping the restrictions on while in practice privileging them. And you can think of the history of other conflicts also in which Congress has limited arms exports and US political involvement in conflicts. There's always a struggle between the letter of the law and the ability of policymakers to get sort of undermine the spirit by staying within the letter.
What about sanctions on Iran today, right? They're predicated, I believe, right? So there's many secondary sanctions that preclude European countries, right, from trading with Iran. But aren't there also a number of laws passed by the Senate that lock in America's orientation towards Iran that makes it seemingly, even more difficult for Iran to negotiate a position?
I mean, there's certainly a limit to what the U.S. could lift tomorrow, even if it wanted to, right? Even by executive order, what can be lifted are only a few things. Congressional sanctions are much stickier, and there are a number of acts that have been passed in the 2010s, particularly, there were congressional acts that kind of have this ratchet effect. So on top of that, I think at this point, right, what exactly Iran is being asked to do seems right now to be changing from day to day, hour to hour, right? Whether this is even about nuclear non-proliferation, whether it's about regime change, whether it's about missile capacities and other things. Under those circumstances, I think the use of sanctions is extremely limited, because when you can't even stake out a clear negotiating position, this is just degradation that is being pursued. Yeah.
A lot of attention, has been drawn to the what are effectively technology controls since the first Trump presidency, and they continued in the Biden, and obviously of a different sort of character or type, but basically on a continuum. And I wanted to ask you, are there sort of trends in technology and infrastructure construction that realism has to take into account to remain relevant today? What are some aspects of telecom technology and financial technology that augment some of the ways that classical realism thinks about power and the interstate system?
It's a very interesting thing to think about, because I think classical realism does not have a single way of even understanding what economic power really is, right? Whether it's GDP or the size of the industrial base. And you can kind of see some of that confusion happening right now in the debate about US-China competition. Because on the one hand, US GDP nominally is still bigger, about 1/3, maybe 30% or so bigger than China's. But when we look at actual kind of direct material indicators of the Chinese economy, electricity generation, manufacturing value added, amount of steel produced, amount of ships produced, right? I just saw earlier today that China last year produced 56% of the ships in the world that were launched last year, right? So these sorts of things, it seems China has a more formidable industrial base. However, the US has long argued, right, that having a large GDP is more helpful, because if you have a very rich economy, that means you don't have to tax your own citizens as much to afford a high-tech, high-quality set of defensive and offensive capabilities. So the US still has a kind of sense that just growing the pie as much as possible is going to lighten the load of defense spending. And as long as certain strategically important weapons can continue to be produced, it's happy to do so. I think China is much more wedded to a set of technological indicators that are non-monetary in size. So it doesn't care that much, I think, about the financial value. And there's a lot of deflationary tendencies in the Chinese economy that also, I think, tend us to underestimate the value, how valuable a lot of Chinese technologies and things produced in China really are. So I would say that realism first should figure that one out. And maybe there's interesting debates also to be had between realists now over what the best measure is. I certainly think that it depends also what kind of competition, right, one envisions. If this is simply going to be arms racing, if this is going to be more concretely focused on things like nuclear realm and ballistic missiles, or undersea competition. So all of that is helpful. In sanctions, and particularly in economic warfare, I would say that a number of other indicators become important. It's clear that China now has a very powerful instrument in the kind of chokehold it has over rare earths supplies. That's certainly something that any realist, right, because it's a vital input in the US military-industrial complex, any realist from the US side will have to take that into account. Conversely, the US still has a lot of power over Chinese finance. China still uses the dollar very heavily. So there seems to be a kind of mutually assured ability to do quite a lot of damage to each other there. I've talked to people who are optimistic, for example, that the US can exert very heavy damage on China through an oil blockade, because by taking away Chinese demand for oil, it would actually lower the world's oil price. So the sanctions against Russia drove up the oil price because they blocked Russian oil production inside Russia. Sanctions against China by blocking Chinese demand actually will lower the price of oil. So there will be less of a spillover. And the argument basically is that that makes them easier to impose. Against that, however, there I think are also very good analyses. There's a good study from a year or two ago by Hugo Bromley and Ike Fryman that suggests actually that this so-called Malacca dilemma, right, that China can be blockaded at the Malacca Strait and hidden its oil supplies, is also overstated, that China has stockpiled a lot more energy, and that it can very easily divert imports through third countries, and that there will always be a way to get oil to China simply because one cannot afford not to sell to the world's largest importer of fossil fuels. Yeah. So
And they're also
yeah, it depends
be
what
making
time. What time you. Sorry.
EVs and the green transition too. They're seeming like they have a good 20-year horizon in which.
Absolutely. Over time, economic pressure on the energy front against China is absolutely going to lose its bite. And there it's again like two birds with one stone, right? You have all sorts of inherent social, economic, cost advantages, environmental advantages to switching to green energy, and a huge strategic one as well, which is the prospect of actual energy autarky on the horizon. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's sort of fascinated me since getting more into international relations, and basically since COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, you can't take my eyes off a lot of this stuff. Not just the books and stuff, but obviously the newspaper. But I'm kind of increasingly drawn towards is the history of the later Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing is, obviously the way that Western economic interaction with the Soviet Union, helped break apart the Warsaw Pact and led to the fall of the Soviet Union. But there's also an important part of them, and this is where there's an important sort of an important addition can be added to realism, is the role of dual use technologies, which is now very important part of discussions with China, and that's the role of telecommunications technology, computers and computerization, digitalization of not only consumer products, but the actual military hardware itself, and that the depth of the market in the West and pooling of technology and research and development is what allowed them to stay at this cutting edge in fighter aircraft and submarine technology and stuff like that. I was wondering if you had any insights on that, or about the how that might well, we probably both know that very much affects Chinese strategic planning, but do you think there's some lessons in that for today?
I think so. I've recently been doing a lot more reading about the history of export controls, and there's some very good books out there, actually kind of gone under the radar in the last few years, because first everyone, of course, in 2022 and afterwards was focused on sanctions, but export controls are also even more technical and arcane in terms of bureaucracy, and even more slow acting, right? And you kind of never see the dramatic effect of an export control, whereas you can kind of see the effect of sanctions, even if it's indirectly, more visibly. But I think you're right to zoom in on that period, and I would even say that it matters before the end of the Cold War. One of the biggest breakthroughs, it seems to me, is the fact that China got out from under a very serious export control embargo on U.S. technology in the early 70s as part of the normalization of relations with Nixon and Mao. And it was Zhou Enlai, China's premier and foreign minister, who was extremely adamant that China should get technological access. And what's also interesting is that the Americans were willing to do that because they saw the Chinese as a counterweight to the Soviets. And even in the 1980s, there's another helpful book by Mario Daniels and John Krieger about knowledge regulation and export controls in post-war America, a Chicago Press book from 2022 as well. And what they show is very interesting, that the US state actually encouraged China to take and install and import lots and lots of pretty advanced technology in the 80s and 90s, precisely to offset the late Soviet Union's edge, but also Japan, because they were worried actually about Japan, who was at the technological frontier together with the United States. And so the idea was essentially that China would draw more Japanese production away, and China would be a country that it would be helpful to kind of use as a counterweight against Japan. And that China would allow American firms also to produce at a lower cost. So a lot of the outsourcing of jobs, including in pretty sensitive areas like satellite launches and telecommunications by American firms to China, began then. Now, obviously, right, 40 plus years later, that looks like it was a pretty unconsidered move. But I think that, again, once you start to really look at the history of economic pressure and economic coercion and economic warfare, you find a richly ironic turn of events oftentimes. So, yeah.
So that brings me to another question about economic interdependence in different periods of time.
Yeah.
How do you think about different epochs of the interstate system and the levels of economic interdependence?
Well, I think that the thing that made sanctions possible in their modern form, at least this is my argument in The Economic Weapon, and I'm still very committed to this, is that one needs a certain high level of interdependence for sanctions to be even thinkable, right? In primitive agrarian societies that have very little cross-border trade, self-sufficiency and local household economies, regional and local self-sufficiency is the norm. And so it becomes quite difficult to use cessations of imports and exports as weapons. This is also why when you do see embargoes and these sorts of things used in the Middle Ages, for example, the Mediterranean, but they tend to be used for moral signaling purposes. So, for example, papal embargoes against the caliphate to support crusaders. It's only once you start to get city-states and small mercantile states like Venice, for example, or the Dutch Republic, or Britain, that you develop a degree of the dependency on the outside world that is really, really critical. There is recently actually one interesting example that I came across. So it is worth delving deep into the Middle Ages. There were certain industrial feedstock materials that were used in textile manufacturing, but also in glass blowing and leather tanning, particularly alum. And it's a geological substance, so a rock basically, that was mined a lot in the Byzantine and in the Ottoman Empire, and that was really key in medieval and early modern Europe for having dyes stay in textile once you had dyed them. But it was also used in glass blowing and leather tanning. So kind of one of the early key industrial raw materials. And there was a cartel, basically, of Genoese and papal bankers who had just totally monopolized alum. And as a result, they were able to punch far above their weight. So they did actually use that in a kind of monopoly. And it's only once you get like the development of synthetic dyes and like much more modern developments in the textile industry that, again, that dependency is then relieved because of technological innovation. But anyway, long story short, prior to the middle of the 19th century, once you get an integrated world market in coal and grain, so food and energy really become traded across borders in very large amounts, most societies are just not anywhere near the level of dependency on exports and imports that sanctions are going to have a bite, and so that they will be possible, conceivable. The first era of globalization, so from the 1870s to 1914, definitely changes that. And that's why the first ideas, conceptualizations of crippling economic pressure being used to kind of nip a conflict in the bud come from that period, and they predate World War I. So it's the blockade in World War I that first proves that this is possible. but you already have congresses of peace-loving international jurists who are speculating in the first decade of the 20th century. What if we had an internationally controlled raw materials embargo on any country that ignored an international court or went to war with another country in violation of existing treaties? Couldn't we force them basically to give up the war by doing such an embargo? And that thought is a very globalization induced thought. So I would say that for me, the first era of globalization remains qualitatively different because it brings this into being as a possibility against any medium to large size industrial society, really. And even increasingly against smaller agrarian societies that basically have to import scarce industrial goods and kind of high-tech goods that they can't themselves access from richer countries. So that's what makes that period, I think, very important. Today, of course, that is only increased in importance. But I would say in the 21st century, maybe recently, we have kind of gone overboard a little bit in thinking about interdependence only as a risk. And one of the paradoxes I'm increasingly struck by is that it is absolutely true that there are great supply chain risks, security risks, and other dangers that emanate from excessive levels of interdependence and extremely high levels of globalization and global exchange. But the irony or the paradox is that we're only going to be able to address some of those problems by having more and better interdependence. So diversifying to more different countries rather than just one, or finding groups of suppliers, right, bundling together so that you can share among a group of countries certain essential goods. So I think the answer to the risks of interdependence is going to be interdependence structured in a different way, but
Regional stabilities, right?
yeah,
Like things, right?
totally. But it's not going to be a return to self-sufficiency. And at the same time, I think that, the discourse about de-risking, maybe slowly we're coming around to the idea that actually, plenty of ways we're going to remain dependent, but we need to be dependent on the right people or on many different people a little bit, which is better than being very dependent on only one or two countries. Yeah.
Great. Since we're on more sweeping historical topics, you are almost done with a new book, right? The
That's
Age of
right. Yeah.
Confiscation. What are the major themes of it? Or what's the
So
narrative?
this book came out of my research and interest in sanctions, but it's now, I think, fair to say that I've become focused on economic coercion in general. Sanctions are a particular interstate version of that, and there's definitely a lot of international economic coercion in this book too, but the topic is the history of expropriation and the coercive seizure and transfer of property. So a lot of the book is really about what societies do internally and domestically. But I do think that there are many important links between what they do domestically and how the ability to seize property and confiscate property is a vital dimension of state capacity. That's one of the claims of the book. And on the other hand, the international system that states belong to. So the environment in which certain state capacities take root is a very important context for figuring out why certain states develop certain capacities. And so you cannot really look at a state in isolation and just say, oh, this has very good state capacity and that one is lacking these things. It's also very much that's where history comes in. History creates a set of conditions in which certain capacities and capabilities are much more developed. So this book starts in the 17th and 18th centuries and goes all the way up to the present. And it's really an account of how the West, and particularly European states, became very skilled at the use of expropriation because they had to, in a sense, wrest themselves out of a world of incredibly dense property rights, which was the feudal property order. And in the process of overcoming the very tough nuts that represented, they developed confiscatory powers, enclosure of common lands, secularization of church and religious property, subduing nobles and taking the land of powerful landowners, learning how to default on their debts, and basically expropriating their creditors, and a variety of other ways of expropriation and confiscation that they then took with them and used to build these quite expansive colonial empires in the New World, and ultimately also used to modernize their own economies. So the big theme of the book, insofar as it really has a revisionist argument, is to really recenter a lot more of the history of expropriation and confiscation on Europe, on rich countries, on the rich core of the capitalist world, and to argue that it had a lot of positive as well as negative effects, but that a lot of confiscation happened within rich countries, and that if we see this only as a story about Western colonialism or dispossession of indigenous peoples, we get only part of the story. Likewise, if we only emphasize that confiscation and expropriation are everywhere and always a hindrance to economic development, we also miss precisely the things that made Europe so powerful and rich and made its states so capable. And I think probably that is an easier thing to see now, not just when we have lots of Western states, right, using sanctions and freezing property, talking about confiscating property, but also when we are faced with the spectacular economic rise of China, which very much has not respected the ordinary orthodox rule book when it comes to property rights, right? So it's quite ironic that the previous Nobel Prize in economics was given to Daron Acemoglu, who very much still adheres to an account in which the West became rich because it respected property. So this book is really trying to portray a more complete and accurate and full picture of the world. Yeah,
I see. So it's sort of like you're sort of they sort of against just the institutional economic historian framework, right? Was it White and North or something like that?
Yeah, it's North and Weingast, exactly. Yeah. So again, and it's been great to read so much of their work. A lot of the work is still very valuable, and it has a lot to recommend it. And I don't mean to disparage everything that they did, but I try to have a historically informed account that is much fuller than what they do, because theirs is quite abstract. It's also really been dispelled and criticized by many historians as an account of, say, what happens in Britain during the Glorious Revolution, how we should characterize the economic development of the United States in the 19th century, for example.
The Dutch, right? That's
Precisely. So it's really meant to give a more balanced and, in a sense, a more dramatic also rendition of how the West diverged from the rest, and how also that has now in many ways come to an end. Yeah.
And is a part of that story a kind of reinterpretation of Roman law and its sort of absolute property rights?
Yeah.
I'm trying to
Yes.
finish this by James Whitman, From Masters of Slaves to Lords of Lands, which is more of a story of late antiquity to Middle Ages, but it seems like there's a kind of a common thread in terms of like conceptual tools of appropriation unlocking
Yes.
new forms of wealth, right?
Absolutely.
Some is less scarce, which ties into this review you did of Arnaud Oran's book, which you must have sort of been like kind of slightly ticked off that he took that title. Right.
Well, I was actually very happy, and no, because it's, most people actually, when you say confiscation, they don't even really react at all, because it's a quite arcane term, or they might think about getting your car possessed or something for a parking ticket.
Exactly.
Yeah, but no, these are. I think neither of us is interested in small scale, criminal or legal violations and fines and penalties. We're interested in the big transformative economic processes. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the, I guess, big, innovations? Obviously, I know the, Schmidt story from Nomos of the Earth, different, not just the, Grossordnung idea, but even before then, these different ideas about what states have the right to do in both international waters, but also in unclaimed land, rules of warfare, if lines of communication or rights of commerce are neglected. are there, is this also a story of innovations in international law that
Yes,
make this possible?
absolutely. And it's probably not completely irrelevant that I'm Dutch. And so my view of this is really shaped by a kind of Grotius inspired account of this, where a lot of the histories of Anglo-American liberalism center on Locke as the key figure, right? The kind of whether you count him as a real, genuine, fully developed liberal or a proto-liberal in a way, at least he's beginning to get to a liberal account of property, right? Of um, some goods and land mixed with labor and kind of the beginning of an account of individual rights that have to be protected against sovereign power. So all of that, I think, is very understandable, and that's very much fits in with quite snugly with an account also of the Anglo-American political tradition as being focused on constitutional rights, on the protection of individual property, life and liberty, contract, these rights. Grotius gives you a much more rough and tumble account of modernity. He spends plenty of time talking about individual rights and individual liberty, and he was himself, in his views, really very much a liberal, but he was also a very hard-nosed commentator about what states did to each other in the international order. Those rights were not at all a given, and I think he had a very powerful account of the fact that war and emergency situations and all sorts of calamities, whether they're epidemics or natural disasters, essentially the big eruptions and shocks that periodically happen in society, um, give the sovereign enormous rights to infringe and take property for the common good and in the public interest. And Grotius is the person who, in that sense, I start with him because he develops the first modern political theory of expropriation, and he calls that eminent domain, right? The domain that is eminent and has precedence over the domain, the dominion of individual property owners. And of course, right, what bigger acknowledgement could there be of the relevance of that than the fact that that's what expropriation is called under U.S. law? That's what the founders were inspired by. So to me, this Grotian lineage, this political idea that the essence of sovereignty and the essence of statehood lies in the ability to take property, actually is a very clear through line through the origins of a lot of Western states even today. And I hope that in current circumstances also of instability and chaos, we can see that we need to complement that vision of the rights-bearing subject being protected with a sovereign capable of intervening, for better and for worse also. There's no guarantee that the results will be good, but that this at least is a power that has very deep roots in our own Western political tradition and is not Oriental despotism or some external thing that we are, being invaded by. It comes from our own legacy. Yeah.
Yeah. The what the Schmittian criticism, right, of liberalism is has to do with this aspect of invoking rights to appropriate, even though it affirms the sanctity of private property.
Mm-hmm.
And of course this is tied right to his idea of the British sea powers versus continental land powers, and it's more of a related to how they conduct themselves in war, right?
Yeah.
And think what are the rights of states. Do you think that's a good description of the difference between basically Anglo-American approach to spheres of influence and rules of interstate interaction, or versus the continental powers? Is it peculiar to the fact that the British had such a powerful navy?
The thing about Schmidt is that it seems to me, both in Nomos of the Earth, but also in his other writing, is that he was always kind of torn about what his relationship to those liberal rights of property really was. And a key one that really comes into it that I also talked about at great length in The Economic Weapon is neutrality. If you want protection for your goods on the high seas, one of the things that you want is you want your goods to be protected from seizure by two other countries fighting, right? And that's also what Schmidt very much romanticizes as the jus publicum Europaeum, the old order of European neutrality, in which if you were not party to a conflict, it didn't involve you, you were not affected by it. Sanctions obviously blow that out of the water, but the other side of Schmidt, which is the much more empire-minded, Großraum-oriented Schmidt, who is Schmidt in the era of the German far right and Nazism, seems to advocate in 1941 particularly, right, a world of Monroe doctrines. Let each great power have their Monroe sphere. And so their neutrality also is out the window. There are only spheres of influence left. And I think I see Schmidt in that sense as someone who is a very interesting figure to read symptomatically, as someone who expresses the incoherence, the incomplete transition from that old world of neutrality and liberal rights coming under assault from the forces of total war in the early 20th century, and someone who just bit the bullet and said, then I want my empire to be the strongest. And he tries to have it both ways, and I think the result it doesn't really work politically, but I think you can see that he was expressing that tension, which was very alive in the interwar period.
Yeah. And then you can see how modern warfare necessarily has to transform this like previous classical early modern period of maritime warfare, right?
Mhm.
Because as you described, the necessity of securing extractive resources, all kinds of natural resources, mean you can't still operate as if the world is open and most resources could be available just over the horizon when you encounter some, native tribe in an unexplored area, right?
Yes.
And so those wars are mostly about, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're mostly about securing trading rights, forcing one side to agree on a treaty, and terms of exchange.
Yes.
That's what most of these maritime wars are about, right?
Absolutely. And here, Oren, who you already brought up, he's an early modern historian, so he's the right person to make this point. But he has a very powerful criticism of Schmidt, because he says Schmidt thought that this transgression and all-encompassing absolute war was a hallmark of liberal maritime powers, and that landed powers, because they were bounded, were terrestrial, respectful, and had a way in which they
Conventions of
precisely that you
of-
could have agreements. But in fact, the history of early modern exploration is largely maritime powers agreeing on exclusive zones and agreeing on closing the seas. So it's not the case that they actually had this unlimited, unbounded thing. Sea exploring powers were just as invested in having their sea and having others excluded from it. And this actually became even more fraught because of fish and whale and all these sort of the fruits of the sea, so to speak, moving in the water also. So it's much harder to take a claim to it, of course, than it is to land.
Well, this actually brings me to this. Are we in a period now in which obviously nuclear weapons make it crazy to have full-scale war, right, between other nuclear powers? There's so many ways you can imagine a state states like that being able to survive if cut off from this or that technology or a particular resource. Do you think we might be in a period in which some dynamics like the 17th and 18th century maritime wars occurred, in which there'll be obviously lots of corporate sanctions, seizures on the high seas to control different countries' access to technology or move up on value chains and things like that, will be more of the tenor of actual kinetic conflicts, as opposed to trying to invade a great power and occupy it and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that since I was really dwelling on Oren's argument, because he makes this claim, there's a lot of stuff, particularly what's happened with regard to the US blockade against Venezuela, that very much seems to go in that direction. And um, the other precedent for what happens in Venezuela, where now the United States is effectively controlling Venezuelan oil exports and keeping the money that Venezuela earns by selling its oil in a special account and then deciding how much it will disperse. That actually harks back not so much to the 17th, 18th century of original mercantilism as to the late 19th, early 20th century. So the age of,
Gun
yeah,
diploma.
precisely. And that's very much something, the kind of receivership that the US set up in Central and Latin American states when they defaulted in the 1890s and early 1900s. So to see that in the 21st century definitely feels like a kind of throwback to the past. Yeah.
Let me ask you about this. One of the pieces you wrote in your Substack about de-dollarization,
Yeah.
which is you know, on the tip of everyone's tongue these days. You compare the response to the oil shock of '73 and the construction of the petrodollar regime, and then the Carter freeze on Iranian oil dollars after the Islamic Revolution, as a series of events that began a process of de-dollarization, but it was different in character than what's going on now. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason to dwell a little bit on that period is that I think people have a very static understanding of what US dollar power means. Some might assume that this has gone back all the way to 1945, when it actually took some time until the 60s, at least, for the dollar to really become as powerful. Sterling and the pound was first still very powerful. Or they might trace it to the Bretton Woods period ending in 1971 and say, well, once the dollar went off gold, then the dollar itself really became the only game in town. And what's interesting is that the 70s were a period of real crisis that were also perceived by US policymakers as a potential end of US post-war hegemony. So it's not until the 80s that they realize, actually, wait a minute, we can figure out a new economic model in which the dollar, rather than resting on our ability to generate current account surpluses, gives us power because precisely we run current account deficits. And so we net export dollars by running a trade deficit, and others accumulate them and then reinvest them in US assets. That was a totally novel form of hegemony. There's no case of any great power or country in history having that sort of power before. Britain in the 19th century was a powerful financial force, but it ran export surpluses always, current account surpluses. And so that's one thing. And initially in the 70s, that period saw huge inflation also. Of course, delinking the dollar from gold, all sorts of domestic pressures, the oil crises all played a role in that. But what that all added up to was a broad movement by international investors and by other central banks out of the dollar and looking for alternatives. And the issue is that there just weren't that many alternatives. So it was quite difficult for quite a long time after World War II to buy any West German assets, for example. The Swiss franc was attractive, but there just weren't enough Swiss francs around. Really, Switzerland is too small an economy, even today, to accommodate even 10% of the global demand for kind of safe haven currency. And the Japanese, but all of them were still running big surpluses, and so they were accumulating the claims rather than allowing others to denominate claims in their currency. So in the late 70s, what this sort of desire to get out of the dollar for kind of long run secular reasons, this desire begins to dovetail and gets a huge push in the back from a geoeconomic event, and that is the freeze of Iranian assets in the United States and also outside of the United States, as long as they are denominated in dollars. So euro dollars, right? Offshore Iranian dollars held in London and elsewhere are also included in this. And that at the time was by far the largest asset freeze ever undertaken. 12 billion at the time was immobilized. And it was a really big shock because this is, of course, the period of petrodollars where lots of oil producers had these big bank accounts with billions of dollars sitting in them. And it led to a sustained move by current account surplus countries, especially oil producers that had, still a tense relationship with the United States because they had been part of the oil embargo against allies of Israel in 1973. So trying to figure out those countries, where exactly should we place these dollars? And even Saudi Arabia, and I think this might surprise a lot of people to hear, we think of the Saudis as one of the most loyal American allies in the Middle East. By 1986, the Saudis had diversified so much that only about 1/3 of their reserves was left in US dollars. So a lot of the rest was in German, Japanese assets, and also a lot in gold and also in real assets. So increasingly buying stock in companies, becoming a kind of sovereign wealth fund, basically, rather than just a holder of dollars. So all of these things put together make for a very interesting thing, which is that the dollar reaches the low point of its share in international foreign reserves at the end of the Cold War, actually. And we're still today
And
above
then
that.
in the 90s, it goes up again, though, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a very interesting first de-dollarization, and that's why I wanted to point out this episode that when today people are asking, oh, is the growing use of sanctions spurring a move out of the dollar? The answer to that is yes, it is, but it is also only going to have a big effect if other forces join it. One of those might be simply growing global uncertainty about the institutional integrity of the United States, right? Just whether the U.S. can still be relied on to be a safe haven, whether the U.S. fiscal position is sustainable, all sorts of other factors. But the most important thing is just to add an extra big case to our historical imagination that even de-dollarization is not new. There have been periods where there has at least been one period of relative de-dollarization. It's just that after that there was re-dollarization. And so it's possible for this to happen multiple times.
And one of the things you claimed is that this time it's broader in the sense that more states, more holdings are doing it.
More countries are participating in it. That's one. The other thing that's interesting is that it has more destinations. So you see that it's going not just as it was then. The German mark doesn't exist anymore, but it's not just going into yen and euros. It's also going into non-traditional reserve currencies. So those are basically the currencies of very small open economies. Canada, Singapore, Sweden, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, these sorts of countries. And it's going very significantly also into real assets, into gold. Of course, we've seen a huge driver into gold. And I think the reason why that's important is that once you put it into more different pots, the chances that all of these pots or alternatives are going to become unattractive again and cause huge re-dollarization is smaller. If you put it into fewer alternatives, then there's still much bigger opportunity to shift back. I think this is going to be more permanently allocated outside of the USD now. Yeah.
Gotcha. You had another one on the sort of history of national expropriations, and how that fit in with different, first within the non-aligned movement. You make the very important point that it wasn't just a kind of a move or policy that communist states made, but it was many a nationalist, developmentalist state, and sometimes just a cronyist state.
Yeah.
But that there's a broad and important history there. And I actually was reminded of a book I read when I was in college.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Which I mean, when I would read at the time, it was like the most boring thing in the world. I couldn't, you imagine in your early 20s, all this stuff it's legalese and stuff, but it's not, I've sort of looked at it in the last year. It's sort of, fascinating to think about how another state taking the property of another has not always been, for one, uncompensated. Usually when people talk about it, it's just as if, they just stole our stuff and are totally undermining property rights. But there's a long history of arbitration on this. And I remember in the Lipson book, one of his arguments is that basically in the 70s, most states had found ways to, compensate others for it's usually a matter of, well, in Latin America would often be the land that large, fruit agricultural companies own, like United Fruit. But later on, it becomes oil rigs and other technology.
Yeah,
Um,
mines.
there's
Yeah.
it just seems that that's a very important part of any state rising in its technological capabilities and autonomy, and shouldn't necessarily be seen as a grave sin if it's compensated and there's rules on this.
Absolutely. And the compensation norm exists for a very long time already, and it's been followed much more frequently than it has been broken. So it's quite striking. I think that indeed, like you were saying, people have a much too maybe dark or problem-ridden view of this. Oftentimes, that of course doesn't mean that expropriation is uncontroversial. The controversy is about what compensation counts as sufficient, right? And actually, that can still lead to conflict. So, famously, you already mentioned, right, United Fruit. When Arbenz in Guatemala nationalized a lot of land during the land reform, including big plantations by United Fruit, he did something that on the like sort of on the face of it is a kind of fair retribution for tax avoidance, which is that he paid United Fruit the value of the land that they had declared in their tax returns, where they had grossly understated the value of the land. And he said, you will get what you could say it's worth. And then said, they of course were like, oh, no, it's worth much more. Similar issue emerged in Iran when Mossadegh takes over the Anglo-Iranian oil company in the same period. So, right, the interesting thing is that the big controversial episodes of expropriation, and we're definitely going to have more of them. They're happening right now. There's actually a substantial and rising number of resource nationalizations, not just in Latin America around lithium and mines, but also in sub-Sahel and Saharan Africa, the cool belt, right, of these new states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, are all really claiming, again, a lot more power over uranium, copper, iron ore, and these sorts of things. And most of the disputes about this are not going to be about whether or not there will be compensation. It will be about whether the compensation is sufficient. So, in a sense, what my book also, which goes into a lot of these cases, tries to argue is that if we really want to have debates and analyze expropriation fruitfully and productively, we need to understand that basically compensation isn't just a straightforward solution. That's the whole field of politics, right? That's the domain in which you struggle for your claims and your interests, and in which technical expertise and all sorts of other relevant contexts, the power of social movements, geopolitical threats, all of that goes into these discussions. So we need to get much smarter and much more clued in about compensation and how to do this. And another very interesting case recently is TikTok, which,
Right.
right?
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there, the valuations of, by most accounts, ByteDance is one of the most profitable social media companies in the world. I think they had in the hundreds of billions of revenue. I think even larger than Meta last year. So
Yeah.
really, really
500 billion or something. Right?
yeah, right. So if you
300.
right, if you take the total, usually the total valuation, that's not profit, that's just revenue. But even if the profit is a small chunk of that, presumably the valuation of this company as a multiple of its annual earnings after depreciation and interest should be at least in the many hundreds of billions, and probably even beyond a trillion. And it seems like for a while the U.S. was really just going to lowball for this stake, and I still haven't really seen any of the numbers of what the 80% American shareholders have actually paid for that 80% stake. I have you? I don't know.
No, but and one of the provisions is the Chinese would add to 10% of, right, and maintain.
Yeah, they keep a
control
20%
the
stake.
algorithm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, I really wonder what went on behind the scenes there. Obviously, there's a ton going on in US-China relations, so I'm sure that this was about much more than just TikTok. But basically, that was an expropriation situation, right? Because a forced sale is effectively an expropriation. It's parting with your property involuntarily. You have to sell. And the only thing the Chinese really could do, given the nature of the US law, was to try and get the best possible price and conditions for it. And what they now have managed to extract, which I think is very meaningful, is that it's effectively run as a licensing agreement. So they keep the algorithm, and they get paid a licensing fee by the American shareholders, the majority shareholders, for the use of the TikTok algorithm, while the American operator has all the data and sort of runs the company day to day. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes my head kind of hurt to think about how one does appropriations in the digital space with companies that are, either social media or obviously, I mean, this is something that's maybe you can enlighten me, but the role of like software development. And I mean, these take up, huge amounts of revenue for production of, um, I mean, not only computer programs, but even the things that operate machines too. And
Absolutely.
pieces of technology. It's a very abstracted world that I don't know. Yeah, if you can, is
No,
there any full of
it
like sort of rules of thumb
it
and how these things work?
And I think that still a lot of the time there's a sort of simple multiple of earnings, discounted cash flow analysis, right? Like what are um what's the annual cash flow that something brings in, and then using a discount rate, projecting that a certain amount of years into the future. That's one basic way of doing it. But then there's a big intangible element, which is the company's reputation, its name, its popularity, right? What they call goodwill. And that's essentially very hard to come up with a solid material foundation for, and yet it's oftentimes a substantial part of the valuation of these firms. This also goes into the difficulty, and this is also something that I talk about in the new book, seizures of IP, of intellectual property and patents, because patents are very difficult to value. When you take a piece of land or you take a going concern, an industrial asset, a factory, these sorts of things, that's a relatively straightforward proposition. There's usually a market price for land. There's usually a traded price or a secondary market price that you can reach for corporate assets. Financial assets, right, are also marked to market or traded over the counter. But
And there's usually a time limitation on patents, right?
yeah,
So that,
totally. So it becomes very difficult, and yet some of the really big appropriations and expropriations, not just of the recent past, but also of the early 20th century, have been in the realm of intellectual property, including by the United States, which used them very effectively to develop its own industry in the interwar period, when it seized a lot of the patents belonging to the German chemical and pharmaceuticals industry and really used it behind a big tariff wall to build up its own now, globe spanning pharmaceutical and chemical industry. So DuPont, Monsanto, Union Carbide, all of those big American chemical firms arose essentially out of using confiscated German patents after World War One. Yeah.
um, we mentioned China earlier, and it's sort of, I guess, more nebulous property rights regime, and this is something you all often hear about. China stealing technology, which the best, or I don't know if it's the best informed, but one of the person was Branko Milanovic.
Hmm.
I remember a couple of years ago reading something he wrote where it was basically not a denial, but instead a kind of comparison of other, um, highly industrialized countries that have had lots of economic interaction with the U.S., South Korea, Japan. Maybe Japan isn't even a best example because they kind of did so well, I think, on their own as well. But many other countries, he looked at it, I think, in terms of maybe it was amount of trade or amount of investment and the number of, claimed property, intellectual property theft, and made it seem as though China's wasn't as bad as people normally
Mm.
portray it. I want, and another, just a quick other question is there something sort of inherently, I don't know, what is it, wishful thinking or a pipe dream to imagine that when you engage in production with a population on their country, with their engineers, with their managers, that when they find other employment, they're not going to take some of that know-how too? I mean, there's a lot of even in like my fiance is in software engineering and stuff, and rules about how when you can go to another company, what you can and can't do, and have access
cooling off
to.
periods. Yeah.
Right. So I was just wondering if what have you thought about that at all with China and the property theft stuff?
I mean, the issue of IP theft in China is serious and big, and everyone who goes there and operates there will tell you that. But the thing is that it does not seem to have really stymied American and more broadly just Western and also rich country, Japanese investment. Japan is still the largest foreign investor in China, more than any other country in the world, and it doesn't seem to have really slowed that down for the simple reason that China is such an enormously large market that even when you lose in the aggregate a few billion a year in lost profits because of IP theft and appropriation, the overall sales that you generate are still so enormous. And the gains that you secure by producing there at low cost, lower than elsewhere, still allow you to, it more than offsets it. So the thing is just that the amount of money made thanks to having China in one supply chain is more than enough compensation for IP theft as essentially a cost of doing business. And I think that that's also what's interesting and what the institutionalist economists and institutionalist historians sometimes miss about property rights and their importance in economic development. They really feel like this is a sort of rule book that you must follow. And obviously, if I give you two equally attractive markets, same growth prospects, one has very good property rights and one has mediocre, you'll go and invest a lot more in the one with the good property rights. But the thing is that most markets aren't exactly presented that way. And China has such enormous potential and has had it because it's been one of the fastest growing markets in the world, that the opportunity cost of not being in China is far larger than the small amount that you lose every year to IP thefts, right? So
I think that's how Tim Cook talks about it exactly.
Exactly. So, and it's interesting here that like the economists and the analysts, but mainly the institutional economists, have a much more constricted view of what's possible than practitioners, than business people who basically accept this bargain of some expropriation of my stuff happens all the time and it's just the cost of doing business, but it doesn't matter because at the bottom line, enough is gained. And I think that that is a broad thing you see in the history of expropriation, that the smartest capitalists are not the ones who always try and fight it and resist it, but the ones who manage to compartmentalize it, hedge against it, compensate for it, get good compensation, or guide it into directions where it benefits them. And that's another thing, right? A lot of China's expropriation is not just of IP, but also of its own land and of its own farmland, which is owned by communes and town and village enterprises. And that's really local government that has expropriated it, and multinationals hugely benefit from it because essentially all of their factories are on land that the local government expropriated from farmers. So who is really gaining from expropriation in China? It's not just the state, it's also the foreign investors. And the losers, in some sense, are ordinary Chinese people, although they too, of course, gain in other ways. So I think that that's the kind of the reality of expropriation in the Chinese growth model is much more multifaceted than just they're doing it and the West is accepting something it shouldn't accept.
Are you good on time?
Yeah, probably I have another like 5 or 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay, let me pick a good one to close out
Sure.
on. Dan Wang's recent book, Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future, has become very popular recently. And he counterposes the American lawyer state of lawsuits, litigation, and technology sanctions to the Chinese engineering state of industrial ecosystems and state-directed R&D. Do you think that the American sanctions regime is a good encapsulation of this American lawyer ethos? Do you think there's something to his description?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the way sanctions are used, they're definitely very much pushed out through a legal infrastructure that also depends on companies doing their own enforcement and over complying. So when you talk to sanctions specialists, over compliance is a word that comes up a lot, and compliance departments in firms run the world, right? They determine what any manager, anyone, even at the very highest level, oftentimes can and cannot do. So if you can, as a state, get a compliance department to implement essentially your foreign policy priorities by making an entire country non-investable in the eyes of that firm, then you have done your job. And that's what the American state and its sanctions apparatus is particularly good at. So its norms about which countries are out of bounds and which are fine to trade with tend to get taken over by global business much more. So in a sense, there's a kind of OFAC effect in global compliance law that over-compliance is the norm, and they export those restrictions very effectively. And that explains, for example, why some companies don't re-engage even when formally sanctions get lifted, because the companies will not make different decisions. The states have tried to lift restrictions, and we saw this with the Iran deal in 2015. There was actually some lifting of the sanctions by Obama and Kerry, right, after the JCPOA went into effect. But it didn't result in a huge economic renaissance of Iran because most companies continue to steer well clear of it. So I think that there's something to that. But I think, of course, that Dan Wang is mainly interested in economic development, right? And how you get over this issue of holdout interests. And there, right, it's interesting to note that the United States also has powers of expropriation that are used relatively frequently on behalf of private parties. So real estate developers do tend to use them. It just is the case that it is still possible also for private proprietors to hold up eminent domain actions and appropriations for public use for many, many years, particularly if we're thinking about, high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles, to name just one idea, for example. In other countries, not just China, in France also, or in Japan, things like that would get built very quickly because the state will not be held up by class action lawsuits and big kind of joint lawsuits by the holdout proprietors blocking that trajectory. Yeah.
Great. Well, one last
Yeah.
question. How do you stay well informed? What are your, besides, Bloomberg or Financial Times, what are your sources of keeping up on things like shipping and, corporate politics and things like that?
Yeah. Well, kind of two things is like you have to dive quite deep into reports that come out that are oftentimes published by organizations themselves. So I tend to read quite a bit of that, particularly when there's good data statistics gathered in them, whether it's United Nations reports, about GDP growth, IMF reports, or private companies or think tanks putting things out about renewable energy or particular inputs and raw materials. And then the other thing is actually just going out into the world and talking to people. And that's very time intensive, but oftentimes much more fun. And it helps to offset some of the incredible kind of naive hyper empiricism that you get if you only study statistics, because you ultimately do need to really talk to practitioners and people out there and figure out how do they think about this, what is the feeling in certain sectors, in certain areas, in certain institutions, in businesses, in governments. And so I don't get as much time to do that as I would like. I try to do it as much as I can when I'm traveling, and just on a running basis keep up with people in industry, people in think tanks, people in government. But that's actually where I get oftentimes some of my most interesting leads. And then it's something someone says in one of those conversations that then lead me to dig much deeper into what data I can find. But I think maybe one other thing about staying well informed that I will say is I think we cannot ignore the importance of reading a lot about the past. Because it's so difficult to stay abreast of everything happening now, forward looking. You cannot keep up with this torrent and onslaught of information. So you need to have certain structural pictures and theories in your head about how the world works that are based on past experience. And it really helps to think about even seemingly arcane bits of the world system, whether it's in politics or economics or technology or institutions. Um, so that once something happens in that domain in the present, you have a whole world picture filled out that you can then revise in light of information. But I think oftentimes the problem is that a certain kind of empiricism is actually just as blind as someone who doesn't keep up at all, because you're just trying to incorporate oncoming information, but there's no theory of the case to fit it into, no structural framework in which to order that information. So, it's like a concept experience without concepts is blind. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, but I was mixing up
Yeah,
concepts
yeah,
and
yeah.
spins and stuff in my head.
No, but it's
Um,
very true, and I mean, like you need to keep looking for the big picture and think about that because otherwise, right? Like that's also what makes us still, I think, more capable than computers and than AI is that we are able to tag back and forth between these levels. Yeah.
Great. Well, Nicholas Mulder, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much,
Really
Mario.
appreciate
Pleasure to be on.